It all started like this. You wake up in a damp wooden hut. Your blanket is a scratchy wool sheet, and your morning alarm? Probably the sound of a chicken stepping on your face. Welcome to Dark Age Britain, a time often imagined as a 1,000-year-long thunderstorm full of mud, blood, and moody bearded men. But was it really all gloom and doom? In this video, we're going deep. We're talking about food, homes, war, religion, and even medieval dating vibes. From farmers and warriors to monks and mothers, we're peeling back the layers of myth to show you what life in Dark Age Britain really looked like. No candles needed. So, grab a drink, ale if you're going for authenticity, and let's hop in our metaphorical time machine. Just watch your step, it's muddy back there. Understanding the Dark Ages. Let's get one thing straight. The Dark Ages weren't actually dark. Well, they didn't have streetlights or smartphones, but that's not really what the label means. When people say Dark Ages, they usually mean the period in Europe after the fall of the Roman Empire, roughly from the early 5th century to around the 11th. In Britain, it kicks off with the Romans packing up in 410 AD, saying good luck with the barbarians, and heading back to warmer, less invaded parts of the empire. Now, why dark? That's because historians in later centuries, usually ones obsessed with Roman statues and tight togas, looked back at this period and said, "Ugh, no marble, no aqueducts, no written history, what a mess." So dark here means less documentation, not constant zombie apocalypse. Though with the Viking raids and the general lack of antibiotics, it did get intense. Let's imagine you're a Romano-British citizen. You're used to a life with heated floors, public baths, wine, fancy Latin words, and roads that go in straight lines. Then suddenly the empire collapses, the legions leave, and it's like the government just ghosted the entire island. Taxes? Gone. Army? Gone. Central heating? Definitely gone. It's a massive social hangover. The cities slowly emptied out, the roads began to crumble, and local warlords, some with more charisma than qualifications, started carving out their own territories. Imagine if your local neighborhood watch group suddenly took over as the ruling government. That's the vibe. As Roman order fades, waves of new groups start arriving. The Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, Germanic tribes from what is now Germany and Denmark, saw an opportunity. Britain looked like a good place to settle, and maybe pillage a little while they were at it. They weren't just marauding barbarians, though. Some came as mercenaries, hired by desperate local rulers to defend their turf. But as history often goes, they liked the view, put their feet up, and decided to stay. Imagine hiring a bouncer who moves into your house and eats your cereal. Over time, these groups blended, fought, married, and bickered their way into creating the early Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. They brought their own gods, their own language, Old English, which sounds like someone gargling Norse, and their own way of doing things. Now, before you start wondering if we're just making all this up with creative flair, here's how we actually know about this period. Archaeology. Burial mounds, weapon hoards, burnt-down villages. Basically, people's trash has become historians' treasure. Chronicles, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, and Bede's ecclesiastical history. Imagine history books written by monks with strong opinions and no chill. Runes and inscriptions. Think of them as ancient tweets carved into stone. Oral tradition. Stories passed down for generations. Some ended up as epic poems like Beowulf. Others probably got dramatically exaggerated, like your uncle's fish stories. Still, there are big gaps. We don't have Netflix-level documentation here. Sometimes it's like trying to solve a murder mystery with only half the clues. and your witnesses are skeletons. Post-Roman Britain wasn't one kingdom. It was a buffet of petty kingdoms. You had the Kingdom of Kent, Mercia, Wessex, Northumbria, East Anglia, each with their own kings, rivalries, and internal drama. Game of Thrones wishes it was this messy. Power shifted constantly. Alliances were made and broken like bad Tinder dates. Kings would rise through battle, lose in a surprise skirmish, and end up either exiled or decorating the end of a spear. But it wasn't just war. These kingdoms built identities, laws, languages, and cultures. They weren't Roman anymore, but they weren't totally new either. They were creating something else entirely. Spiritual life in early Dark Age Britain was also going through major transitions. Before Christianity came knocking, again, most Anglo-Saxons followed a pagan belief system. Gods like Woden, Thornor, yes, that's Thor, and Frigg. Nature spirits, charms, omens. Spirituality was woven into daily life like a well-used wool cloak. But starting in the 6th century, Christian missionaries, most famously Augustine of Canterbury, arrived with crosses, holy water, and a very convincing sales pitch. Over time, Christianity spread, often fusing with local traditions. Churches rose where temples once stood. Some gods got demoted to evil spirits. Others quietly disappeared. We'll dive deeper into this in a later chapter, but it's not bleak. So, in a word, the Dark Ages is nothing like it's a medieval horror movie. Just remember, there was light. It just didn't come from a light bulb. The next we will be discussing is how the people of those times were. The people of Dark Age Britain. If you were to time travel to Dark Age Britain and stand in the middle of a bustling village, or even a quiet clearing with a few thatched huts, you'd quickly notice something. These weren't just barbarians grunting in the mud. These were people. Complicated, layered, diverse people. Some wore brooches that would put your grandma's jewelry to shame. Others were barefoot and herding goats. Everyone had a role. Everyone had a story. Let's meet them. At the top of the food chain were the kings, or, if we're being accurate, kynings. These guys ruled over the various Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, like Wessex, Mercia, or Northumbria. Some were born into the role, others hacked and slashed their way there. Kings were expected to lead armies, keep the peace, or start a good scrap, dispense justice, and hand out gifts like medieval Oprah. And no king ruled alone. He had a group of elite noblemen called thanes, kind of like a royal squad. They advised, fought, managed estates, and made sure the peasants didn't get too uppity. Some kings even had laws written in their name. Ian of Wessex, for example, had an entire legal code that included such gems as, if someone breaks into a man's house, let him be slain there and then. No trial, no questions, just medieval home security. Below the kings were the thanes, pronounced thanes. Yes, like in Macbeth. They were the local elite, landowners, warriors, administrators. If you were a thane, you were probably the richest guy in your village. People came to you with problems, tribute, and complaints about their neighbor's cow eating their crops. Thanes didn't just sit around looking fancy. They were expected to be loyal to the king, raise warriors when needed, and show up to battles in full gear. If a king was throwing a feast, thanes were on the guest list, right next to the roast boar and mead. Becoming a thane wasn't easy. You had to own land, serve in war, and have at least 5 hides of land. A hide being the amount of land needed to support a household. Basically, the early version of 5-bedroom duplex. Beneath the thanes were the churls, the free peasant farmers. These were the regular Joes, or Jords, of Dark Age Britain. They owned small plots of land, farmed them with their families, and could be called to fight if the local lord demanded it. Think of them as the medieval middle class with calloused hands. Chorals were respected. They weren't nobility, but they weren't slaves either. They paid dues, followed laws, and had rights. Some even served in the local militia. If you were a choral, your life was hard, but you had your dignity. And your pigs. Pigs were important. Now, if a choral did really well, like saved up, bought more land, married into a wealthy family, he might even rise to thin status. Social mobility was rare, but not impossible. So, dream big, muddy boots and all. At the very bottom of the social pyramid were the thralls, slaves. And here's a surprising, sobering fact. In early Anglo-Saxon England, slaves made up as much as 20 to 30% of the population. They were usually prisoners of war, debtors, or people born into slavery. Their lives were brutally hard. They worked the fields, served in households, dug ditches, ground grain, and essentially kept everything running while getting none of the credit or pay. Some slaves had better lives than others, especially if they worked inside a home instead of out in the freezing rain. Some could even buy their freedom or be freed by a generous master. But for many, slavery was lifelong and generational. It's not the romantic, sword-swinging vision of the past we often get, but it's the real one. These were people whose stories rarely got written down. Now, let's talk about the women, because they were far more than background characters in a man's world. In many parts of Dark Age Britain, women had more rights than you'd expect. Anglo-Saxon law codes actually protected certain women's rights, like owning property, receiving compensation for crimes against them, yes, there was a whole price list, and managing households. A free woman, especially a noble woman, could run an estate, oversee servants, and even command respect in legal matters. Some were abbesses, leaders of double monasteries, overseeing both monks and nuns. Ever heard of Hilda of Whitby? Total legend. Ran a major monastery, hosted synods, and may have mentored the first Anglo-Saxon poet. Marriage was often a strategic alliance, yes, but it came with negotiated dowries and legal protections. And if a husband was caught cheating or abusive, in theory, she had recourse. In practice, well, it depended on how important her family was. Of course, poor women had far fewer protections. They worked just as hard as the men, sometimes harder, tending fields, animals, children, and fires. But they were still part of the legal and social world, not just stuck in the background. Children in Dark Age Britain weren't coddled. There was no TikTok, no snacks shaped like cartoon animals. Childhood was short, and survival wasn't guaranteed. By age 7 or 8, most children were already working, helping in the fields, tending to animals, learning crafts, or preparing for marriage. Education, if it happened at all, was mostly for boys in noble or monastic households. But they weren't joyless little robots. Kids played games like knucklebones or spinning tops, sang songs, and probably made a mess of things just like kids today. There are even archaeological finds of tiny wooden swords and dolls. Life was hard, yes, but it wasn't all grim. Families cared deeply for their children, and you can see that in their burial customs, grave goods, tiny jewelry, and careful interments that show grief and love. Religious figures occupied a curious space in society. Monks and priests were often highly educated for the time, literate, and deeply respected. But they were also weird. Monks shaved their heads in the style of Roman tonsure, lived communally, prayed constantly, and wrote beautifully illuminated manuscripts that they definitely didn't think anyone would be turning into YouTube content one day. They often came from noble families, second sons, or ambitious youths. Monasteries became powerhouses of influence, education, and land ownership. On the local level, Priests were important for baptisms, marriages, and burials. They offered spiritual guidance, dispensed penance, and probably heard all the gossip. There were also wise women, cunning men, and healers who operated outside official religion, offering herbal remedies, protective charms, and the occasional suspicious ritual. Depending on the century, they were either respected or burned. Here's a thing that often gets overlooked. Dark Age Britain was not ethnically homogeneous. It was a mix of cultures, tribes, and heritages. You had native Britons still hanging on in Wales, Cornwall, and parts of the north. Anglo-Saxons settling across much of what we now call England. Vikings arriving later, marrying locals, founding towns like York, or known as Jorvik. Irish missionaries setting up churches in the north. And even remnants of Roman culture lingering in language, law, and ruins. People intermarried, traded, fought, converted, and sometimes coexisted peacefully. It wasn't one culture, it was many, woven into the rough tapestry that would become medieval Britain. Dark Age Britain wasn't just a backdrop for epic battles and Viking raids. It was a living, breathing society filled with farmers, kings, warriors, weavers, slaves, poets, mothers, monks, and children. They lived, loved, mourned, feasted, fought, and built the foundations of the nation we know today. What daily life was actually like? If you think living in Dark Age Britain was all sword fights and shouting, "For the king," while sprinting through the fog, I have news for you. Most people weren't warriors. They were just trying to get the goat out of the kitchen without stepping on a rake. Let's zoom in from the battlefields and royal halls and focus on where most life actually happened: the home, the hearth, the places where families huddled together during long winters and probably argued about whose turn it was to fetch water from the stream. Forget about bricks, tiles, or indoor plumbing. Most people lived in simple timber-framed houses, their walls made from wattle and daub, aka woven sticks packed with mud and straw. Roof? Thatched. Windows? Nope. The doorway did all the lighting and ventilation. These homes were usually just one room. Yes, one room. You, your spouse, your kids, sometimes your in-laws, and quite possibly your livestock. It was a party. In the middle of this one room was the hearth, an open fire pit used for cooking, heating, and probably choking everyone with smoke. Chimneys weren't really a thing yet, so the smoke just kind of hanged out. You'd think they'd all have lungs like coal miners, and maybe they did. Furnishings were minimal: a few wooden benches, maybe a table, straw bedding in the corners. Privacy? Non-existent. You didn't have a room to slam the door and brood in, unless you counted standing outside in the rain. Let's get one thing straight. Dark Age Britain was not as dirty as many people assume. Sure, they didn't have soap in cute bottles labeled cucumber mist, but they cared about staying relatively clean, especially by early medieval standards. Most people washed in rivers, streams, or from wooden tubs. Bathing wasn't daily, but it wasn't unheard of either. In fact, Anglo-Saxons were known to bathe fairly regularly, at least once a week. That's practically luxury. They used natural materials like ash or lye soap for scrubbing, and combed their hair with intricately carved bone combs, which archaeologists keep finding, by the way. Lice? Probably, yes, but they did try. Clothing was often made of wool or linen and worn in layers. You'd have your undertunic and overtunic, maybe a cloak. Shoes were leather, handmade, and about as waterproof as a sponge, but they did the job. There were no electric heaters or fairy lights here, just good old-fashioned fire. The hearth provided warmth, light, and cooking fuel, but firewood wasn't always easy to gather, especially in winter. Running out meant you might literally freeze your buns off. For lighting at night, people used rushlights,
Candles made by dipping dried reeds in animal fat. Romantic? Maybe. Smelly? Definitely.
Imagine trying to sew, repair tools, or read, if you could read, by flickering rushlight in a smoky hut while a cow stares at you. That's the vibe. So, what did they eat, you ask? It wasn't all roast hogs and turkey legs like in the movies. Your average Dark Age Briton's diet was heavy on grains, light on pizzazz. The staple was pottage, a thick stew made of whatever they had lying around. Think barley, peas, leeks, onions, herbs, and sometimes bits of meat or fish. Each pot simmered for days. Yes, days. It was like medieval slow cooking, just with fewer recipe books. Bread was another key item, usually made from coarse ground barley or rye, and baked in communal ovens. Wheat was a luxury. They also grew vegetables, kept chickens for eggs, and raised pigs, which were practically garbage disposals with legs. Milk, cheese, and ale were common. Everyone drank ale, even kids, because water could be dangerous to drink. It's not that they wanted to be buzzed at breakfast, it's that water sometimes came with parasites. Cheers! Meat was usually reserved for the wealthier folks, but peasants could get lucky during festivals or if a pig was slaughtered. Hunting was often banned in noble-owned forests, so getting caught with a deer might cost you your hand. Life was hard, yes, but not without joy. When the chores were done, or at least pushed aside, people did find ways to unwind. Storytelling was huge. Skalds and bards would recite epic poems, folk tales, or heroic sagas around fires. Think Game of Thrones, but everyone's name is Ethel something, and there's less nudity. Music was also a favorite. People played lyres, flutes, drums, and even rudimentary bagpipes. Singing was common, especially in groups, and there were plenty of riddles, jokes, and communal games to go around. Feasts were a big deal, especially on religious holidays or when a local lord felt generous. There'd be meat, ale, laughter, maybe a wrestling match or two. For one evening, you could forget the mud under your feet and just enjoy being alive. If you were a peasant, and you probably were, your life revolved around work. Endless, bone-deep, back-breaking work. In spring, you sowed. In summer, you weeded. In autumn, you tried not to die. You also repaired fences, chopped wood, spun wool, fed animals, fetched water, and probably spent half the day chasing down that one stubborn chicken. Women worked just as hard, often harder. In addition to farming and animal care, they baked, brewed ale, made clothes, raised kids, and kept the fire going. Domestic goddess, try domestic gladiator. Kids were many apprentices. By age 7 or 8, they were expected to help out, tending geese, picking berries, or learning a trade. Childhood was more about survival than snowball fights. If you needed something, you didn't order it online, you made it, or someone nearby did. Blacksmiths were crucial, crafting tools, nails, horseshoes, and weapons. Weavers turned wool into cloth. Potters made storage jars. Carpenters built homes and wagons. Shoemakers, butchers, bakers. It took a village to, well, be a village. People learned these trades from their parents or by apprenticeship. You might be a blacksmith because your dad was one, and his dad before him. Family-run businesses, medieval style. When the sun went down, so did everyone else. Without artificial light, people lived by natural rhythms. Wake at dawn, sleep after dusk. It wasn't uncommon for people to sleep in segments. A first sleep from sunset to midnight, then a short waking period to pray, think, or check on the animals, followed by a second sleep until morning. Beds were straw-stuffed mattresses on wooden frames. Blankets were wool. Heating, the hearth if you were lucky. And don't forget, you might be sharing that bed with your spouse, 2 kids, and a goat. Cozy. That's daily life in Dark Age Britain.
Not glamorous, but rich with grit, community, and a surprising amount of structure. You may not want to live it, but you can't help but admire how they did.
Next up, let's peek into what they believed. Because what's life without a few ghosts and miracles? Beliefs and religion in the Dark Ages. If you thought modern-day beliefs get complicated, wait until you hear what Dark Age Britain was cooking up in the belief department. Picture a spiritual buffet where Christianity, paganism, ancestral ghosts, and woodland spirits are all piling onto the same plate, and nobody's quite sure who's bringing the drinks. Welcome to the fascinating, spooky, and sometimes straight-up bizarre world of Dark Age religion and superstition. Grab your charm bag and say a quick prayer to whichever deity's on shift. We're going in. Let's set the stage. By the early 5th century, the Roman Empire had pulled out of Britain, and along with their soldiers and weird love for bathhouses, they left behind the flickering remnants of Christianity. It was there, sure, but patchy, like someone had installed a spiritual Wi-Fi router and then immediately unplugged it. Enter the missionaries. One of the most famous was Saint Augustine of Canterbury, sent by Pope Gregory the Great in 597 AD to convert the Anglo-Saxons. Augustine landed in Kent and eventually converted King Ethelbert. Boom! Instant royal clout. But it wasn't like everyone just threw away their old gods overnight. Paganism was still deeply rooted in people's everyday lives. Even when they started attending Christian services, many still left offerings at sacred wells or whispered to the trees, just in case. You know, spiritual insurance. The result was a long, messy transition that lasted for centuries. Christianity spread unevenly, with the south and east of Britain converting faster than the wilder, hillier areas of Wales, Scotland, and the north. It was more gradual merger than hostile takeover. Before Christianity, most people practiced some form of paganism, and we're not talking about a unified system with temples and tenets. This was a spiritual pick and mix based on nature worship, local gods, seasonal festivals, and a healthy fear of anything that went bump in the night. Gods were often tied to elements or locations, rivers, forests, stones, hills. You might have a household shrine for the spirits that protected your home, and you definitely didn't mess with the old barrow mounds, burial places, because the dead were very much considered still active. These people lived in a world where everything had meaning. A weird bird cry in the morning, omen. Sudden storm, punishment from a displeased deity. Child born with a birthmark, chosen or cursed. Pagan rituals included offerings of food, drink, or precious items tossed into rivers, buried in the earth, or hung in trees. It's part of why archaeologists keep finding gold in bogs and swords at the bottom of lakes. People weren't littering, they were making divine deposits. And speaking of rituals, when medicine was a mix of herbs, hope, and guessing, you turned to cunning folk, local healers, midwives, herbalists, and sometimes what we'd call witches. These people knew the plants, the charms, and how to say just the right words over a wound. They made salves for infections, teas for pain, and amulets for protection. Did they actually work? Sometimes. Did people believe they did? Always. Magic wasn't separate from religion, it was woven right in. You could ask God for help, sure, but maybe you'd also wear a rune-carved talisman or bury an egg at a crossroads to break a fever.
belt and suspenders logic. Curses were also real concerns. If your crops failed or your cow died suddenly, you might think your neighbor hexed you. People used protective charms made from bones, iron, or even wolf teeth to guard against the evil eye. And if you needed to lift a curse, better find the local wise woman and bring payment. In Dark Age Britain, the dead didn't always stay politely buried. There was a real fear that the deceased could return, especially if they hadn't been buried right, or if they'd been angry or troubled in life. Graves were often oriented carefully, sometimes with
The fear of the restless dead was strong. Ghosts could blight crops, haunt homes, or just lurk ominously in the woods. If you heard strange noises at night, you didn't check with a flashlight. You huddled by the fire and prayed it would pass. This belief gave rise to what modern scholars call revenant lore, basically medieval zombies. Tales of the dead returning, bloated and dangerous, to torment the living. Not exactly bedtime stories, but they kept folks from skipping funerals. On the Christian side of things, once the faith took hold, it got organized. Monasteries became spiritual centers, and not just for prayer. These were the universities of their time, the record keepers, and the spiritual lifeboats when the world went stormy. Monks lived under strict rules, hello, early bedtimes and cold porridge, and they devoted themselves to copying manuscripts, preserving Latin texts, and illuminating some of the most beautiful books in history. Ever heard of the Lindisfarne Gospels? Thank a monk. Monasteries also helped spread Christianity to rural areas. They trained priests, taught local lords, and acted as social safety nets, offering food to the poor and education to those who could afford it or who were lucky enough to be born into the right family. Of course, the church also came with its own problems: corruption, power struggles, occasional outbreaks of self-righteousness. But overall, it provided structure and meaning in an unpredictable world. Religion wasn't all solemn chants and staring at stone walls. There were festivals, and they were a big deal. Some Christian holidays were conveniently scheduled around older pagan ones. Easter, for example, likely overlaps with the old spring festival for the goddess Easter. Christmas smells suspiciously like a winter solstice celebration with a new branding. These festivals gave people reasons to celebrate, feast, and come together. They were breaks in the grind, markers of time, and community events where religion and joy could coexist, often with a healthy amount of ale. People in the Dark Ages had strong feelings about what came after death. In Christianity, the idea of heaven, hell, and purgatory gave people a cosmic scoreboard. Sin too much? Eternal fire. Live right? Eternal bliss. Confess just in time? Maybe you'll get a heavenly loophole. Confession, penance, and prayer became deeply embedded in life. There were lists of sins with preset punishments, kind of like divine parking tickets. And people were very motivated to avoid the fiery stuff. Pagan afterlife beliefs were more varied. Some believed in traveling to the other world, a place of ancestors, spirits, and mystery. Others imagined a warrior's paradise, full of feasting and eternal battle, which sounds exhausting, honestly. In both systems, one thing was clear: how you lived mattered. Your actions rippled beyond your life, and that made people think twice before, say, stealing a chicken or stabbing a neighbor. As Christianity spread, tensions rose between the new faith and older traditions. Pagan symbols were sometimes destroyed, repurposed, or replaced with crosses. Sacred wells were renamed for saints. Ancient standing stones got churchyards built nearby, as if to keep an eye on them. There were moments of real conflict. Pagan shrines were torn down, pagan priests were ousted,
and converts sometimes had to choose between keeping their old ways or being accepted in the new system. But just as often, people blended their beliefs. A Christian might still tie ribbons to a sacred tree or whisper to the moon. Conversion wasn't a switch, it was more like a slow remix. Whether pagan or Christian, religion shaped every part of life in Dark Age Britain. It explained the unexplainable, comforted the grieving, gave rules for the living, and provided stories for the next generation. It was also a tool of power. Kings used religion to legitimize their rule. Priests mediated between people and the divine. Monasteries held land, collected tithes, and influenced politics. Being holy didn't mean being powerless. But it wasn't just about control. Religion gave meaning. It taught people that suffering wasn't random, that the world had order, and that they weren't alone, not in life and not after death.
So, whether you were offering a loaf to a river spirit or lighting a candle to St. Cuthbert, you lived in a world that was spiritually alive. Every shadow had weight, every season had meaning, and every soul, whether saint or shepherd, was part of something bigger. Politics and warfare in Dark Age Britain. Let's not sugarcoat it. Dark Age Britain was rough. And not just stub your toe rough, but hide your grain so your neighbor doesn't burn your village rough. This was a time when leadership was more about the size of your sword and less about your campaign promises. If you could hold land, hold a shield wall, and hold your liquor at a feast, you were halfway to being crowned king. Welcome to the gritty world of early British power politics, where warlords became kings, alliances lasted about as long as a pint of mead, and the throne was more of a whoever's sitting there at the moment situation. After the Romans said cheerio and peaced out in the early 5th century, they left behind more than empty roads and abandoned bathhouses. They also left a massive power vacuum, one that every petty lord, tribal chief, and ambitious warrior tried to fill. The result? Chaos. Glorious sword-swinging chaos. Britain fractured into dozens of small kingdoms and tribal territories. Some had ancient Celtic roots, like the Brittonic-speaking kingdoms of Strathclyde, Gwynedd, or Dumnonia. Others emerged from new arrivals, the Anglo-Saxons, Jutes, and Frisians, who carved out regions like Wessex, Mercia, and Northumbria. There wasn't a single unified Britain, not even close. If you asked someone where they were from, they might say, from the Kingdom of Reged, or from the land of the East Angles, or maybe just grunt and point to the hill they'd been defending for the past decade. Rulers took the title of king, but don't imagine a sparkly crown and velvet robes. Think more along the lines of chainmail, blood-streaked tunics, and political influence measured by the number of warriors you could summon with a horn blast. Being a king meant you were a war leader, first and foremost. If you weren't raiding someone, you were defending from someone raiding you. There were very few off days. Young men trained from early on with weapons: spears, swords, axes, bows. Combat was brutal, up close, and deeply personal. Battles were usually small compared to modern standards, sometimes just a few hundred men. But what they lacked in size, they made up for in intensity. Fighting in the shield wall was the classic tactic. It was essentially a line of warriors pressing together like a very angry rugby team, their shields interlocked, jabbing spears through the gaps. You didn't need fancy flanking maneuvers when you could just push and stab your way to victory. Victory wasn't just about territory, it was honor. A successful raid could mean cattle, slaves, weapons, or precious loot.
It also boosted a leader's reputation and helped attract more followers. Lose a few battles in a row, you might find yourself unkinged rather quickly. And if you were a warrior, your loyalty was usually to your lord or chieftain, not some abstract concept of a country. Your lord fed you, gave you land, if he had any, and led you into battle. In return, you fought for him and probably died dramatically. When you're constantly under threat of being attacked by your neighbors or the neighbor's neighbors, you learn quickly that location matters. Dark Age Britons built defensible homes, often on hilltops or near natural barriers. They reused old Roman forts or Iron Age hill forts, adding wooden palisades and earthen banks. Some constructed wooden Motte and Bailey-style strongholds, early forms of what would later become medieval castles. These weren't palatial residences. A king's hall might just be a long wooden building with smoky fires, dried meat, and a bunch of people loudly arguing about who insulted whose sheep. But even if it was rough around the edges, controlling a fort meant controlling the area around it. And if you controlled enough forts and enough warriors, guess what? People started calling you High King.
It wasn't all swinging swords and shouting. Politics in Dark Age Britain was also played with words, marriages, and oaths. Though, let's be honest, most oaths had a half-life of about 3 weeks. Rival kingdoms sometimes banded together against a common enemy, like the Picts, or the invading Vikings, or just the guy next door who got too cocky. But just as often, those same alliances turned into civil wars the moment the threat passed. Marriages were one of the few stable forms of diplomacy. Kings would marry off daughters to cement alliances, or occasionally demand someone else's daughter as a condition for peace. These unions rarely had anything to do with romance and everything to do with land rights, bloodlines, and trying not to get stabbed in your sleep. The downside? If your father-in-law decided you were weak, he might still attack. Family bonds were strong, but the desire for power was often stronger. Every kingdom had its own version of laws, but enforcement was more about reputation and vengeance than formal courts. If someone stole your cow, you didn't call the police. You showed up with your cousins and took 2 cows back. That said, there were attempts at legal systems. Kings like Ine of Wessex and Alfred the Great later on codified sets of laws dealing with everything from theft to murder to property disputes. Fines were common, called wergild, man price, and the amount varied depending on your social status. Kill a peasant, that'll cost you. Kill a nobleman, get ready to empty the treasure chest. Still, might made right. If you had a sword and friends with swords, your interpretation of the law had a better chance of being heard. Surprise! Women weren't always just in the background. While most rulers were male, there are some fascinating exceptions. Take Cartamandua, a 1st century queen who ruled the Brigantes. Or Ethelflaed, daughter of Alfred the Great, who ruled Mercia in the early 10th century and led armies against the Danes. She wasn't just a figurehead, she was out there in armor, making moves. Women in noble families also played key roles behind the scenes. They arranged marriages, negotiated treaties, managed estates, and sometimes even plotted assassinations. You know, the usual family stuff. Because power was so localized and so fragile, kings rarely died peacefully in their beds. Assassinations, usurpations, and outright coups were part of the deal. The moment a king showed weakness or even died, there was a mad scramble to claim the throne. Blood feuds between families could last generations. If your great-uncle was murdered by the cousin of another chieftain, guess what? You might find yourself expected to avenge him 50 years later. This constant state of conflict is why loyalty and honor were everything. Without a strong network of allies and warriors, even the most powerful king could fall overnight. As if things weren't chaotic enough, the Vikings decided to join the party in the late 8th century. The first recorded raid on Lindisfarne in 793 AD sent shockwaves through Britain, and not just because the monks were unarmed and had absolutely zero armor class. These weren't just hit-and-run pirates, though they were very good at that. The Vikings came in waves, raiding, trading, and eventually settling. They established their own kingdoms, like the Danelaw in eastern England, and frequently challenged native rulers. Some kings fought them, some paid them off, some became them, marrying Norse wives and learning to navigate by sunstone. The line between invader and local ruler blurred quickly. So, what made a good king in Dark Age Britain? Military skill. You had to win battles, or at least not lose too many. Generosity. Kings were expected to reward their followers with food, land, and treasure. Be stingy, and you'd find your throne very empty. Justice. Fair, or at least predictable rule helped secure loyalty. Ancestry. Claiming descent from gods or legendary heroes didn't hurt. Charisma. You had to inspire people to want to follow you into battle, or at least shout convincingly over the noise of a feast hall.
Some kings were remembered for greatness. Offa of Mercia, who built a giant earthwork to keep the Welsh out. Or Alfred the Great, who reformed the military, promoted learning, and probably didn't burn as many cakes as the legend suggests. Others, not so much. History doesn't remember every warlord with a bad haircut and a fragile ego. In the end, warfare was the backdrop to everything. Religion, farming, culture, all of it existed in the shadow of potential conflict. Villages practiced how to hide their food. Children grew up learning not to trust strangers on horseback. Songs celebrated victories but never forgot betrayals. And yet, somehow, from this bloody, chaotic mess, Britain began to form its early identity. Tribes turned into kingdoms. Kingdoms turned into nations. And all of it was built on the backs of warriors, kings, and countless forgotten fighters whose names were never written down, but who shaped the land all the same. Ooh, that was a ride, wasn't it? Want to keep going? Next up, we will see how ordinary people live. The lives of ordinary people. Forget kings, forget castles. Let's talk about the real heroes of Dark Age Britain, the ones who didn't have gold goblets or thrones or epic poetry written about them. That's right, we're diving deep into the daily grind of ordinary people, the farmers, herders, weavers, blacksmiths, and probably the one guy whose job it was to keep chickens from wandering into the bread oven. Because here's the thing, while warlords were out stabbing each other for the crown, most people were just trying to stay alive, keep their crops from dying, and hopefully not catch something incurable from a communal drinking cup. Glamorous? Not exactly, but essential? Absolutely. Let's start with farming, because that's what most people were doing. Britain in the Dark Ages was overwhelmingly rural. No cities, few towns, just a whole lot of countryside and a lot more mud. If you were lucky enough to have your own small plot of land, congratulations! You were probably a seorl, a free peasant. If you didn't own land, you likely worked someone else's, often in exchange for food, shelter, and the occasional reminder of your place in the social hierarchy. Daily life was a cycle of planting, weeding, harvesting, and praying the weather didn't betray you. Crops were basic but reliable: barley, wheat, oats, rye, and spelt. People used simple wooden plows pulled by oxen. No tractors here, just raw muscle and early morning grumbling.
Fields were often organized into the three-field system: one field for winter crops, one for spring crops, and one left fallow, i.e. for Mother Nature to do her thing. That way you didn't completely murder your soil. A typical meal in Dark Age Britain wasn't exactly Michelin-starred. It was more like what's edible and nearby. The diet was mostly grain-based. Think porridge, aka pottage, flatbreads, and more porridge. Meat was rare for the lower classes, but you might get pork, goat, or chicken if you were lucky, or if you happened to live near a lord with generous leftovers. Vegetables were crucial: onions, leeks, beans, peas, turnips, and the ever-glamorous cabbage. Fruits like apples and berries were seasonal treats. And everything, absolutely everything, was cooked over an open fire, usually in a large pot that never got cleaned. It just simmered forever, kind of like a perpetual stew of whatever we have. Water wasn't always safe, so ale was the go-to beverage, even for kids. It was weak by modern standards, but at least it didn't try to kill you with parasites. Your average Dark Age home was a far cry from a modern apartment. Most were wattle and daub huts, wooden frames packed with mud, straw, and manure, yes, manure, to keep out the cold. Roofs were thatched, windows were non-existent, and insulation came from huddling together and hoping you didn't roll into the fire pit while sleeping. Inside, the furniture was minimal. A bench or two, maybe a table, and piles of straw or skins for beds. Families, and sometimes animals, shared the space. Privacy? Not a thing. You sneezed, your entire family knew about it.
And let's talk about the smoke. Most homes had a central hearth for cooking and warmth, but no chimney, so smoke just lingered. Your eyes stung, your clothes stank, and your lungs probably hated you. But hey, it kept the bugs down, so maybe call it a win. Fashion in Dark Age Britain was all about function over form. Most people wore tunics made of wool or linen. Men wore knee-length tunics with trousers or leggings. Women wore longer dresses, sometimes with aprons. Both wore cloaks fastened with brooches and belts for tools and pouches. Shoes were usually made from rawhide, and you better believe they got soggy. No rubber soles, no waterproofing, just good old hope it doesn't rain today optimism. Color was rare unless you had access to dyed fabrics, which meant you were probably wealthier than most. But even among the poor, people added decorative stitching, beads, or tiny bits of bronze for flair. Gotta flex a little, right? Not everyone farmed full-time. Villages had skilled artisans who made the world go round. Blacksmiths forged tools and weapons, potters shaped cooking vessels, and carpenters built furniture and houses. There were also leather workers, weavers, basket makers, and even bone carvers. These weren't factory jobs, just small-scale, often family-run operations. Tools were simple, but the craftsmanship could be incredibly skilled. A well-made knife or cloak pin wasn't just practical, it was a point of pride. Bartering was common. If you made good axes, you might trade one for a bushel of grain or a pair of shoes. Coins existed, but they weren't used every day unless you were in a wealthier trading area. If you could read or write in Dark Age Britain, congratulations, you were basically a wizard. Literacy was extremely rare outside of monasteries and church circles. Most people relied on oral traditions, songs, stories, and spoken law. Children learned by doing. If your dad was a thatcher, you learned to thatch. If your mom spun wool, you learned to spin. There were no report cards, but plenty of stern glares if you messed up a batch of cheese. Life wasn't all work. People needed to unwind, and they did so with music, storytelling, dancing, and games. Storytellers, or scops and bards, were beloved. They kept history, legend, and humor alive with tales of heroes, monsters, and foolish neighbors. Music involved lyres, harps,
pipes, and drums. And if someone got a hold of imported wine or strong mead, party time. Board games like Hnefatafl, a Viking strategy game, were popular, and athletic contests like wrestling or foot races offered a bit of fun and probably a few dislocated shoulders. And of course, there were seasonal festivals. Harvest time meant food, drink, bonfires, and, let's be honest, a whole lot of slightly drunken poetry about cows. Before Christianity spread, most people followed pagan beliefs, animistic, tribal, deeply connected to nature. Trees, rivers, stones, they all had spiritual significance. Spirits and ancestors were revered, and offerings were made to keep them happy. You didn't want to annoy the local river spirit. Trust me. With the arrival of Christianity, thanks to missionaries like St. Patrick, St. Columba, and St. Augustine of Canterbury, paganism gradually gave way to church teachings. But the transition wasn't instant. People blended old and new. They'd go to church on Sunday, then leave food out for forest spirits, just in case. Religion provided a moral framework, but it was also practical. Monasteries became centers for learning, healing, and even hospitality. If you were sick, poor, or traveling, a church might be your only safe stop. Families were large and extended. Your kin mattered a lot. They were your protection, your identity, your community. You didn't just answer for your own actions, but for your cousins, your uncles, and sometimes your great-aunt's goat-related feuds. Marriage was about alliance and economics, not romance. Women worked hard, cooking, weaving, brewing, child-rearing. Men hunted, built, fought, and argued about land boundaries. Children were expected to help from a young age, whether in the fields or keeping the fire going.
But despite the hardships, people loved their families fiercely. Births were celebrated. Deaths were mourned deeply. Life was short, often brutal, but filled with moments of joy. Healthcare in Dark Age Britain was basically try herbs and hope. Local healers used plants, charms, and prayers. Some remedies worked, many didn't. Common issues? Malnutrition, parasites, infections, childbirth complications, and the occasional wolf bite. A broken leg could mean a permanent limp, if you survived at all. Death was constant. Life expectancy hovered around 30 to 40 years, and infant mortality was high. But people didn't walk around depressed all the time. They found meaning in faith, family, and laughter. They also took death seriously. Burial practices varied. Some were pagan with grave goods, others Christian with simpler interments. Either way, the afterlife mattered. Whether you were aiming for heaven or just hoping not to haunt your neighbor's sheep, rituals were observed with care. Despite everything, communities were tight-knit. Everyone knew everyone. Gossip was currency. Help was expected, whether that meant fixing someone's roof or defending them in court. Isolation was rare and dangerous. People identified with their village, their clan, and their land. Names carried meaning. Stories bound generations. Identity was deeply rooted in where you were born, what your people had endured, and what you hoped to leave behind. And there you have it. Life for ordinary people in Dark Age Britain wasn't easy, but it was full. It was loud, messy, sacred, and beautiful in its own resilient way. Religion, superstition, and learning. If you time-traveled back to Dark Age Britain and started waving around a flashlight or quoting Shakespeare, there's a good chance someone would either try to worship you or set you on fire. Why? Because this was an age where religion, superstition, and learning weren't just part of life, they were life. And the lines between the sacred, the mystical, and the utterly baffling were gloriously blurred. So, grab your incense, your best goat for sacrifice, just in case, and a sturdy lantern.
We're heading into the flickering, candlelit corridors of Time traveled back to Dark Age Britain and started waving around a flashlight or quoting Shakespeare. There's a good chance someone would either try to worship you or set you on fire. Why? Because this was an age where religion, superstition, and learning weren't just part of life, they were life. And the lines between the sacred, the mystical, and the utterly baffling were gloriously blurred. So, grab your incense, your best goat for sacrifice, just in case, and a sturdy lantern. We're heading into the flickering, candlelit corridors of monastic wisdom, ancient pagan rites, and the slightly confusing worldviews of our Dark Age ancestors. Let's set the stage. Before Christianity rolled in like a sanctified tidal wave, the people of Britain followed a rich tapestry of pagan beliefs. And no, that didn't mean everyone was running around in cloaks under the full moon chanting, "We are the daughters of the witches you didn't burn." These were deeply spiritual, often nature-centered faiths rooted in the landscape itself. Forests had spirits, rivers had personalities, hills, oh, they were definitely haunted. The world was alive, and everything in it, from animals to trees to the sun and moon, carried meaning. The Anglo-Saxons, for instance, worshipped a pantheon of gods with very Viking-sounding names. Woden, Odin, was the chief god, associated with wisdom and war. Thunor, Thor, handled thunder and protection. There was also Tiw, Frigg, and Ostre, the spring goddess whose name would eventually inspire the word Easter. Temples weren't common in the sense we'd imagine. Instead, sacred groves, stone circles, and natural features served as places of worship. Rituals often involved offerings of food, weapons, or animals, and possibly the odd human, though that's still debated. The idea was simple. Keep the gods happy so your crops don't fail and your enemies die first. Starting around the 4th century, and then in earnest from the 6th century, Christianity began to spread like wild incense across Britain. Missionaries such as St. Patrick, St. Columba, and St. Augustine of Canterbury weren't just converting individuals, they were overhauling worldviews. These guys weren't subtle. Churches were often built atop old pagan sites. Saints replaced local spirits. Christian festivals like Christmas and Easter strategically overlapped with older celebrations to make the transition smoother. But it wasn't just about out-converting the competition. Christianity brought new ideas of salvation, sin, heaven, hell, and a structured afterlife. Suddenly, what you did on earth really mattered in the next life. Also, literacy entered the scene in a big way. The Bible needed reading, so did sermons, hymns, and
rules about fish on Fridays. Monasteries in Dark Age Britain were like Hogwarts minus the magic and with worse food. They were centers of education, healing, hospitality, and more parchment than anyone knew what to do with. Monks lived lives of devotion, discipline, and, let's be honest, lots of sitting. They prayed 7 times a day, worked the land, copied manuscripts, and sometimes produced breathtaking art like the Lindisfarne Gospels or the Book of Kells. These weren't just religious texts, they were masterpieces of calligraphy, color, and patience. Learning in monasteries wasn't limited to theology. Monks studied medicine, astronomy, mathematics, and even history. They preserved ancient Roman and Greek knowledge, keeping the intellectual torch alive through centuries of chaos. And when they weren't deep in study, monks also served their communities. Need a bandage, a meal, a safe place to sleep? The local abbey probably had you covered, unless you were excommunicated, in which case, good luck. But just because Christianity was growing didn't mean everyone gave up their old beliefs. Far from it. The two systems coexisted, overlapped, and occasionally glared at each other from opposite ends of the village. People still believed in witches, elves, spirits, and omens. A raven flying east might mean good luck or bad, depending on who you asked. Strange dreams, definitely a message. A cow giving sour milk, someone had probably cursed you. Magic wasn't stage tricks and top hats. It was the mysterious, unseen force running behind everyday life. Charms, herbs, and incantations were used to protect against illness, ensure good harvests, or keep demons at bay. Even Christian leaders got in on the action. Some saints were believed to perform miracles, cure disease, or even control the weather. Pilgrimages to sacred wells and relics blended old and new beliefs. Holy water was sprinkled liberally, and you could never have too many crosses carved into your doorframe. We tend to think of the Dark Ages as a time when everyone forgot how to read, write, or tie their sandals. That's not entirely fair. While literacy was rare among common folk, it flourished in religious circles. Monasteries collected books, many imported from Ireland, Gaul, or even Italy, wrote chronicles of local history, and taught new monks the basics of Latin and theology. Women weren't completely excluded either. Some noble women became abbesses, running powerful double monasteries where both men and women lived, learned, and worshipped under one strictly Platonic roof. Hilda of Whitby is a famous example, a formidable leader who presided over one of the most important religious synods of her day. And while most peasants couldn't read, oral tradition thrived. Storytelling, music, and communal memory passed knowledge down from one generation to the next. A well-told tale was as powerful as any scroll, and often more fun. Healing in Dark Age Britain was a beautiful mess of herbalism, prayer, and what we'll politely call experimental techniques. Monks recorded remedies in manuals, often blending classical knowledge with local folk cures. Honey, for example, was a popular antiseptic. Garlic was used for infections. Willow bark, which contains salicylic acid, the stuff in aspirin, was chewed for pain relief. But there were also less scientific ideas floating around. Some ailments were believed to be caused by sin or demons, requiring confession or exorcism. Leech therapy? Oh yes. Bleeding a patient to balance their humors? Absolutely. One Anglo-Saxon medical text, Bald's Leech Book, includes remedies like onion and bile eye salves that, bizarrely, have shown some effectiveness in modern lab tests, so maybe not all of it was quackery. Magic wasn't just tolerated, it was complicated. Some spells were condemned by the church. Others were quietly accepted as folk practices, so long as they invoked God or saints instead of pagan deities. A farmer might say a prayer while burying a charm under his field. A mother might murmur an old rhyme over a sick child's head. These weren't seen as rebellious, just necessary. Life was unpredictable, and you needed all the help you could get. Clerics often drew lines between white magic, healing, protection, and black magic,
Harm, curses. But even that distinction could get fuzzy, especially when something went wrong and people needed a scapegoat. Whether pagan or Christian, people in Dark Age Britain had strong beliefs about what happened after death. For pagans, the afterlife might involve a journey to an ancestral realm or a warrior's paradise like Valhalla. For Christians, it was all about heaven, hell, and purgatory. Funeral customs reflected these beliefs. Pagan burials often included grave goods, swords, jewelry, even boats to help in the afterlife. Christian burials were simpler, but still symbolic, with the body facing east, toward Jerusalem, and sometimes accompanied by a cross or relic. Monks prayed constantly for the souls of the dead. Masses were held, pilgrimages were made. People believed that prayers could literally tip the scales of judgment,
So yes, making friends with a local abbot was a smart afterlife insurance policy. Picture this, a foggy moor at dawn. The air is thick with mist. A murder of crows bursts from a nearby tree. And somewhere in the distance, a haggard woman whispers over a bubbling pot of something you definitely don't want to taste. No, this isn't the start of a fantasy novel. It's a peek into the deep, bone-shivering realm of superstition in Dark Age Britain. Let's just say logic wasn't exactly the driving force of the era. This was a world where people believed illnesses could be caused by evil spirits, where a bad harvest might be blamed on a curse, and where the line between a healer and a witch was about as thin as the skin on a winter onion. To truly understand the mindset, you've got to leave behind modern science. Forget microscopes and germ theory. Back then, if someone got sick, the cause might not be bad meat or dirty water. It might be the evil eye, an angry fairy, or a wandering ghost looking for company. Supernatural thinking filled the gaps left by an uncertain world. And there were a lot of gaps. Let's start with the most notorious figure of the time, the witch. Now, in Dark Age Britain, the term witch wasn't always the same as the cackling, green-skinned broom flyers we know from Halloween decor. In fact, there was no singular, unified idea of what a witch was. Depending on where you lived, a so-called witch might be a healer, a seer, a midwife, or someone your neighbor didn't like and wanted to blame for their dead goat. Folk healers, especially women, were vital to rural life. They knew herbs, poultices, how to treat wounds, how to ease childbirth, and maybe even how to help a cow with a difficult labor. They also often acted as community counselors, storytellers, and informal spiritual guides. Many of them worked out of sheer survival, passing knowledge from mother to daughter. But throw in a mysterious illness, a string of bad weather, or a baby born with a crooked foot, and suddenly those wise women became suspects, accused of causing the very problems they were trying to fix. And let's be honest, sometimes people wanted them to be magical. Who else could explain why one child lived and another didn't? Why your neighbor's crops thrived while yours withered? Or why your husband started sleepwalking and muttering in Latin? Okay, maybe the last one was just too much mead. Superstitions were everywhere. Need to protect your home? Hang a rowan branch over the doorway. Feeling cursed? Burn some sage or carry a charm carved from bone. Think fairies might steal your baby and leave a changeling in its place? Place iron scissors under the cradle. Yes, really. Fairies weren't always the sparkly, mischievous creatures we've come to imagine. In early British belief, especially among the Celts, they were powerful, dangerous, and not to be trifled with. They were blamed for strange disappearances, odd sounds at night, mysterious illnesses, and even dreams that were too real. In some tales, they lived underground, in barrows or hills, surfacing only to meddle in human affairs or steal a snack or a soul. And then we have spirits of the dead. Ancestors were respected, revered even, but death was feared. The line between the living and the dead wasn't a clear-cut border. It was more like a very thin veil that occasionally fluttered open when no one was looking. Ghost stories weren't just fireside entertainment, they were warnings. If a ghost appeared, it meant something had been left unresolved. Maybe a murder? Maybe a broken oath? Maybe someone forgot to properly bury Uncle Ethelstan, and now he's rattling around the village looking for closure. Monasteries recorded all sorts of tales about spirits, sometimes even involving saints who could banish them. But outside the abbey walls, people took matters into their own hands. Grave goods were often buried with the dead, not just out of love, but to keep the dead happy and quiet. Nails might be driven into coffins, charms placed on burial mounds, and sometimes, people were buried face down to prevent them from crawling back. One particularly chilling belief? The Revenant. Essentially an undead being, the Dark Age Revenant was a corpse that rose from the grave to terrorize the living. Think zombie meets poltergeist. These stories often started with someone acting strangely, illness, paranoia, insomnia, followed by the suspicion that someone buried recently might not be quite finished. Exhumation and dealing with the body wasn't unheard of. This wasn't entertainment, it was damage control. And then there were omens. Oh, the people of Dark Age Britain loved an omen. A bird flying the wrong way? Portent of doom. A sudden gust of wind during childbirth? Bad luck. Dreams of wolves? You better keep a sword under your bed. Dreams, in fact, were a big deal. They were seen as messages from the gods, ancestors, or otherworldly beings. Some people even specialized in interpreting them, combining scraps of pagan tradition, Christian allegory, and straight-up guesswork. And religion, of course, was everywhere, but not in the tidy cathedral choir way we think of today. This was a messy syncretic era, where old pagan beliefs clashed, blended, or coexisted awkwardly with Christianity. A family might baptize their baby and leave an offering to a forest spirit. A warrior might pray to Christ before battle and carry a Thor's hammer around his neck, just in case. The church tried to stamp out superstition, but even some clergy were tangled in it. Monks wrote about visions, demons, and miracles as though they were everyday occurrences. Saints were credited with healing, exorcisms, even storm control. And many saints' lives read like magical adventure novels, filled with dragons, glowing relics, and disobedient animals who were promptly smited. Let's not forget werewolves. Yes, they show up in early British lore too, usually as a curse or punishment. There were whispers of whole families in Wales or Scotland said to change shape during the full moon. Some tales were morality plays. Don't break your oaths or you'll wake up Harry. Others were just really good fireside fuel. In all of this, fear was a kind of power. Those who were believed to have the sight or special knowledge, whether feared or respected, could influence their communities. Some were avoided, others consulted in secret. A whispered blessing might save a harvest. A muttered curse might destroy a marriage. It wasn't magic as we understand it. It was belief weaponized. And belief, as we all know, can be more potent than any potion. So, what was life like under this weight of superstition? It was constant negotiation between known and unknown, between the church and the woods, between what you could see and what you felt. You might sprinkle salt at your doorstep, whisper a charm before crossing a river, or touch wood, literally, to keep luck from running off. But it wasn't just fear. Superstition was also a way to cope. When nothing made sense, when your sheep died, your baby fell ill, or your neighbor started screaming at shadows, magic gave you an explanation. It gave you control. A ritual, a symbol, a chant. It turned helplessness into action. In a world lit by firelight, where wolves howled just beyond the trees, and strangers carried strange gods, believing in the supernatural wasn't irrational, it was necessary. Because if ghosts could be real, maybe your loved one wasn't truly gone. If charms could work, maybe your child would live. And if witches did walk among you, Maybe, just maybe, they were the ones holding the last light in a very dark age. Dark Age Britain wasn't a monolithic, faith-blind era. It was a fascinating stew of beliefs, superstitions, rituals, and revelations. Christianity offered hope, order, and salvation. Paganism offered connection to nature and tradition. Superstition offered protection from the inexplicable terrors of daily life. And somewhere between the monasteries and the moonlit fields, between the scriptorium and the sacred spring, people carved out a way to live, learn, heal, and hope. Justice in the Dark Ages. If you're imagining medieval courts as dusty halls full of wise-robed judges and snappy defense lawyers dramatically shouting, "Objection!" sorry to disappoint. Dark Age Britain's justice system didn't come with gavels, powdered wigs, or anything close to a fair trial by jury. What it did have was a lot more an eye for an eye and you break it, you pay, in pigs kind of vibes. Welcome to a world where blood feuds ran deep. Stealing a sheep could cost you a hand, or worse. And your best legal argument might be how many kinfolk could swear you didn't do it. So let's raise the mead horn of truth and plunge into the wild world of early British justice. Spoiler, it's brutal, bloody, and surprisingly bureaucratic. Dark Age Britain wasn't a single kingdom with one shiny, unified law code. Instead, it was a patchwork of smaller kingdoms: Northumbria, Mercia, Wessex, Kent, and more, each with its own customs and legal quirks. The same crime might get you a fine in one place and a foot chopped off in another. Justice was local, flexible, and personal. Most laws weren't written down until kings like Ethelbert of Kent, early 600s, started jotting things on parchment. His code, the earliest known in any Germanic language, is weirdly obsessed with compensation. It reads less like a moral guidebook and more like a medieval IKEA receipt. Break a man's nose, that's 6 shillings. Knock out a front tooth, 4 shillings. Steal someone's cow, pay double its worth, and a fine. It was less about justice as we know it, and more about maintaining peace and balance through what they called wergild, literally man price. Wergild was the cornerstone of Dark Age justice. Every person had a value depending on their social rank. Kill someone? You owed their family a specific amount of money, not time in jail. Nobles cost more than peasants. Women's values varied depending on the kingdom and their marital status. Imagine your cousin gets murdered. Instead of calling the sheriff, you'd expect the killer's family to cough up the appropriate number of silver, cows, or sheep. If they didn't, well, that's when things got messy. Enter the blood feud. The justice system leaned heavily on the idea that your family was your backup squad. If someone wronged you and didn't make it right, financially or socially, your kin had every right to go full Liam Neeson in Taken. Feuds could last generations, involve multiple killings, and spill over into other communities. Kings and chieftains tried to suppress them, but good luck telling angry medieval farmers not to avenge Uncle Leofric. Some kingdoms tried to reduce the chaos by enforcing oaths and mediations. That's where a third party, often a local lord or religious figure, would broker a truce, often sealed with gifts, marriage alliances, or public acts of repentance. But if you spilled the wrong blood, no priest was going to save you from a pitchfork mob.
Now, before you picture a fancy courtroom, think more field with a bench than barrister in a robe. Early courts were community gatherings, moots, usually held in open air, often under large trees,
on hills, or near religious sites. Everyone in the community was expected to show up. These weren't private matters. Justice was public, performative, and a bit chaotic. Elders or local lords oversaw things, and decisions were made based on testimony, custom, and how convincing you could be without tripping over your own lies. No lawyers, no stenographers. Just you, your word, and hopefully a few people willing to vouch for you. You might think justice in Dark Age Britain was all about who had the most swords, but sometimes it came down to your reputation and how many mates would swear they trusted you. If accused, you could clear your name by swearing an oath of innocence, and then having a bunch of your friends or family do the same. These people were called oath helpers or comperjurators. The more serious the crime, the more people you needed. It was basically a popularity contest. If enough upstanding folks swore you were decent, the court would likely let you go. If nobody wanted to help, oof, better start digging your own grave. Of course, not every case could be settled by chatting in a field. For the really tricky ones, or when no one could agree, there was a surefire way to find out the truth. Ask God. Enter the ordeals, a series of divine tests designed to let higher powers reveal the guilty. There were several types. First one, ordeal by hot iron, which is carrying a red-hot iron a set distance. If your hand healed cleanly in 3 days, you were innocent. Another was ordeal by water, and that just means you were tossed into a river. Sink, innocent. Float, guilty. Yes, they really flipped the logic of drowning. And the last one, ordeal by fire, and you guessed it, walk barefoot over burning plowshares. Innocent if unscathed. Spoiler, you were never unscathed. Clergy often oversaw these ordeals, and there was a lot of room for interpretation. Some historians believe the real goal was to pressure confessions or at least scare people into behaving. The legal system wasn't exactly fair. Surprise! Nobles had the resources, networks, and were-guild values that made it much easier to resolve disputes without violence. Peasants, not so much. If you were poor and accused of theft or blasphemy, chances were slim you'd afford a proper settlement, and if you didn't, the consequences could be brutal. Punishments included things like fines, the most common penalty for most things, pay up or else. There's mutilation, lose a hand for theft, an eye for violence, a nose for repeated offenses. Yes, really. Shockingly, there's actually banishment. It's a get out of the village and don't come back. The normal execution, which is reserved for murder, treason, or seriously ticking off the king. As kings gained more power, lawmaking became more centralized. Rulers like Alfred the Great and Ina of Wessex issued formal codes, mixing tribal customs with Christian morals. Alfred's law code, for example, begins with the 10 Commandments and then veers into very specific do's and don'ts about livestock, marriage, and harboring fugitives. It wasn't quite constitutional law, but it laid foundations that would eventually evolve into common law systems. Charters also became a big deal, documents granting land, privileges, or protections. They were written in Latin or Old English and used big wax seals that made them look way more official than the systems they were regulating. Dark Age Britain didn't have cops, but it had something close. Men over 12 were organized into tithings, groups of 10. Each tithing member was responsible for the behavior of the others. If one messed up, everyone could be held accountable. It was peer pressure as law enforcement. Villages also appointed reeves, local officials, and beadles to help enforce decisions, collect fines, and chase down troublemakers. Not quite Batman, but for a guy with a staff and a stern look, it worked. Despite all the blood and fire, one thing becomes clear. Early law wasn't obsessed with punishment for punishment's sake. It was about keeping the peace. A good outcome wasn't always about proving someone wrong, but making things right, restoring the balance between families and within communities. Pay the fine, do penance, bring an offering to church, and try not to murder anyone on the way home. It was far from perfect, but in a world where life was short, survival uncertain, and kin everything, the laws of Dark Age Britain reflected what mattered most: order, reputation, and not dying in a feud over stolen sheep. Homes, families, and everyday routines. So, you've survived the Viking raids, dodged the plague, and didn't get into a feud over a pig. Congratulations! Now let's take a breather from the blood and chaos and step into something a little more cozy. Well, cozy-ish. Welcome to the home front of Dark Age Britain, a world of smoky interiors, muddy floors, close-knit families, and daily chores that would make a modern camping trip look like five-star luxury. If you've ever wondered how your average early Briton spent their day, put on your woolen tunic, grab your fire poker, and let's explore what life looked like behind the thatched roof. Let's be clear, this wasn't HGTV. There were no granite countertops, no open-plan kitchens, and certainly no indoor plumbing. The typical Anglo-Saxon or Briton house was a simple affair: rectangular or oval, one room, and walls made from wattle and daub. That's sticks woven together, slathered with a paste of mud, straw, and manure. Yum. Roofs were thatched, windows were rare or non-existent, and the floor, dirt. Literal dirt, with maybe some straw if you were feeling fancy. In colder regions or among wealthier families, you might find sunken featured buildings, semi-dugouts with walls below ground level that helped retain heat. Some homes also had raised sleeping platforms, because lying directly on cold mud every night is not what you'd call restful. There was usually a central hearth where all the cooking, heating, and fire-gazing happened. Above that, a gaping hole in the roof that let smoke drift out. Sometimes. More often, it just collected inside, leaving everything and everyone smelling like smoked ham. You weren't living alone unless something had gone terribly wrong. Households were communal, tight, and multi-generational. Think grandparents, parents, kids, maybe a cousin or two, plus any farmhands or servants who lived in. In Anglo-Saxon England, the household unit was known as the hus, or hell, and it wasn't just about blood relatives. Loyalty mattered too. Warriors might live with their lord, or free peasants might take in poorer neighbors in exchange for help around the homestead. Marriage was common, but not always romantic. It was often a practical agreement, families joining forces, land being exchanged, alliances formed. Dowries were expected, and once married, a woman's property usually passed to her husband, though there were some exceptions. Women had defined roles, but they weren't passive bystanders. Many ran households, managed supplies, brewed beer, and sometimes even act as healers or business owners. If the husband died, the wife might step up as head of the household. Okay, now let's talk about the daily grind. Life revolved around seasons, sunlight, and survival. There was no 9 to 5. Work started at dawn and didn't really stop until the sun dipped out. Here's a typical day for a peasant family. In the mornings, you have to stoke the fire, it never goes out if you know what's good for you, milk the animals, collect eggs, grind grain for porridge. Midday, just eat a simple meal, bread, cheese, perhaps some dried meat. Then head out to the fields. This could mean sowing, weeding, harvesting, or mending fences. Women might be spinning wool or making clothes. Evening, well, warm stew if you're lucky, maybe boiled turnips or barley soup. The main meal was eaten early, around 3 or 4 p.m. And yes, everyone reused the same bowl. Cutlery was a luxury. Hands or knives sufficed.
Night, no Netflix, just stories, prayers, and collapsing into bed until the rooster says, "Round 2." Oh, and bathing? Rare, very rare.
People did wash, but not daily, and not with soap as we know it. You might scrub down with a cloth and some ash or herbal water. Bathhouses were around in some towns though, leftovers from Roman influence, but rural folk mostly kept things rustic, stinky. Mealtimes were all about what you could grow, trade, or kill. The staples were bread, pottage, a thick soup of grains and vegetables, ale, and maybe salted pork if you had livestock. Forget sugar and chocolate. Your sweet tooth was satisfied with honey or dried fruit, if you were lucky. Cooking happened over the fire in clay or iron pots. Bread was often baked on hot stones or inside clay ovens, when people had ovens. Most homes didn't, so communal baking sites were a thing. Seasons ruled everything. Winter, tough. Spring, hopeful. Autumn, harvest madness. Summer, the only time you'd eat somewhat fresh vegetables, and not just pickled turnips. Water wasn't always clean, especially near settlements. That's why ale was the real MVP of hydration. It was low in alcohol and often consumed by children too. Richer folks sipped on mead, fermented honey, and some imported wine if they could afford it or had Roman leftovers. Drinking was communal. Big mugs passed from hand to hand. And yes, things got rowdy at feasts. But in the home, a humble cup of weak ale by the hearth was the norm. Everyone was a maker. If you needed something, chances were you or your neighbor had to make it. Clothing was woven from wool or linen. Women spun thread on drop spindles, dyed it using plant extracts, and wove it on upright looms. Sewing, all by hand. And yes, one outfit, maybe two. Laundry days were infrequent, and stains, character. Shoes were made of leather. Tunics for men, long dresses with aprons for women. Kids wore scaled-down versions. Buttons were rare. Brooches and belts did most of the fastening. Crafts included pottery, carving, blacksmithing, and weaving. Every village had a few specialists. If you lived near one, lucky you. If not, better learn to fix that broken bowl yourself. Childhood didn't last long. By age 7, you were considered old enough to work or take responsibility. Toys existed, carved animals, little spinning tops, slings, but only when chores were done. Boys helped with farming, animal care, or learning trades. Girls helped their mothers, cooking, spinning, watching younger siblings. There were no schools unless you were monastic or noble. Education, church-based, and mostly for boys destined for clerical life. Illness was common, infant mortality was high, and superstition played a big role in health and well-being. You didn't just feed your kids, you prayed they'd survive the winter. No electricity, no candles for the poor. Lighting came from rushlights, long reeds dipped in animal fat, or maybe a fire kept low at night. You went to bed early not because you were healthy and wise, but because it was too dark to do anything else. Entertainment? Mostly talking. Storytelling, riddles, songs, and maybe a harp if someone was talented. Minstrels and bards were honored guests, especially if they brought tales of distant battles, gods, or epic romances. In some regions, seasonal festivals like Yule, Lughnasadh, or Beltane brought song, dance, and communal feasting. These were the rare times joy took center stage, and the whole village might gather to forget the grind of survival for a night or two. Let's be honest, hygiene standards weren't the best. Thatched roofs leaked, livestock wandered through your living space, and bathing was aspirational. But people did try. Herbs were used to scent clothing, straw was replaced when infested with lice, and ashes acted as rudimentary soap. Health was understood in spiritual and elemental terms. Balance mattered. Too much heat, cold, moisture, or dryness could throw your body into disarray. Midwives, herbalists, and monks acted as medics. Treatments ranged from effective, honey, wounds, to horrifying, leeches, spells, or powdered moss. But even with all this effort, life expectancy hovered around 30–40 years. Still, they tried. That's the part we often forget. Dark Age Britain wasn't glamorous, but it was full of rhythm, of earth, family, firelight, and enduring resilience. In their smoky homes, surrounded by wooden bowls and woolen tunics, these people raised children, loved deeply, told stories, and thought to make it to the next harvest. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't easy, but it was home. The economy of survival in Dark Age Britain. If you lived in Dark Age Britain and asked someone how the economy worked, they'd probably tilt their head, scratch their beard or braid, and offer you a goat in response. That's not sarcasm, that's just the way it was. In the centuries after Rome packed up and left Britain to its own devices, what little centralized economy existed collapsed like a poorly built wattle and daub hut. The coins that once passed through hundreds of Roman hands became more like collectible trinkets than actual currency. The grand road networks leading to Londinium or Eboracum fell into disrepair, and with them went the organized markets, tax collectors, and financial systems. But as the empire faded into mist, people didn't just sit around waiting for someone to invent capitalism. No, they adapted. They bartered, they hustled, they survived. If anything, the lack of formal economy gave birth to an incredibly creative and human-centered system of exchange. Imagine this. You're in a small Anglo-Saxon village somewhere in what we now call Lincolnshire. You've got a pig, a daughter of marriageable age, and a skill for brewing excellent mead. You want wool for winter cloaks. You don't have money, but you've got resources. So you head to the local market, which, let's be honest, is more like a grassy clearing where people shout, and you trade a jug of your strongest brew for 3 bundles of wool. The smith down the way also likes your mead, so he agrees to shoe your donkey in exchange for another jug. Meanwhile, your daughter is being eyed by a local thatcher's family. They've got chickens. You see where this is going. This was life. This was commerce. Not as sterile as spreadsheets and balance sheets, but just as complex. And frankly, a lot smellier. The economy was not driven by coins, though they did exist in very limited circulation, but by relationships, reputation, and an intricate web of give and take. In some places, a man's worth wasn't measured by how many coins he hoarded, but how many sheep grazed on his land, how many people owed him favors, or how many meals he'd earned repairing neighbors' carts. Coins, when they were around, were primarily found in the hands of kings, bishops, or foreign traders. You might see a silver penny in your lifetime if you were lucky, or unlucky, since many of those coins passed through hands during the collection of tribute, taxes, or even ransoms. That's right. Sometimes the only reason a coin left a noble's purse was to get his cousin back from a band of surprisingly entrepreneurial Vikings. But for the majority of Britons, daily transactions happened in the form of barter. Goods were swapped for services. A tanner might trade finished leather for grain. A farmer might promise a portion of his harvest in exchange for the village priest blessing his field. A thatcher might fix your roof and in return expect a place at your fire come winter. It wasn't all transactional either. Generosity played a huge role. In tight-knit communities, giving without immediate expectation of return was common. Not out of pure altruism, though there was some of that, but because favors always circled back around. You help your neighbor now, and next time your cow's stuck in the river, guess who's bringing rope and manpower? Now, let's talk about the real heavy hitters in this world. Livestock. Cows, pigs, goats. These weren't just food, they were capital. A cow could be the dowry for a marriage. A piglet might serve as payment for a pair of boots. And 3 geese could settle a small feud. Livestock weren't just wealth, they were social glue. Some clever folks didn't even need animals or crops. They traded on talent. The village blacksmith, his skill was invaluable. Everyone needed tools, nails, blades, and horseshoes. The blacksmith might never go hungry, even during a bad harvest, because he could always trade his work. Same with midwives, healers, brewers, potters, weavers. If you were good at something, really good, your stomach would stay full. And what about those brave or possibly reckless few who traveled to sell their goods? Peddlers and craftsmen journeyed between villages and early towns, trading pots, leather belts, beads, even charms. Roads were treacherous, but the need for goods and a change of face kept them moving. In a way, these people were the lifeblood of the informal economy, bringing outside news, new tools, and stories wherever they went. Towns that managed to survive post-Rome or grow under emerging Anglo-Saxon rule became microeconomic centers. Places like York and Canterbury hosted markets where merchants might exchange Frankish wine, Gaulish glassware, or Baltic amber, assuming they could afford the sea journey and the risk of pirates. You see, even in what many call a dark age, international trade persisted. It was just riskier, rarer, and often shrouded in fog and superstition. Let's not forget monasteries, many economies unto themselves. Monks not only prayed, but farmed, brewed, wrote, and sometimes even ran schools. They needed labor, supplies, and support from surrounding communities. In exchange, they offered education, medicinal knowledge, and a bit of heavenly favor. That's a pretty good trade when you think about it. 3 eggs and a bottle of honey mead in return for eternal salvation and some herbal poultices. Oh, and speaking of herbal poultices, let's not ignore healers. These weren't just your village grannies. Some had serious knowledge of plants, roots, and remedies, gathered from older traditions and Christian influences. Their skills were in high demand. If your kid had a fever or your husband's toe turned black from a misstep in the bog, you were trading every spare bean you had to get her attention. Of course, not all economic dealings were peaceful or fair. Sometimes people didn't trade, they took. Raiding was its own kind of economic transaction. Vikings were the most famous practitioners, but local warlords weren't above pillaging either. Plunder was profit. And when kings realized it was cheaper to pay off raiders than fight them, the infamous Danegeld system was born, large payments made to keep Viking swords at bay. This was the mafia in chainmail. Lovely village, shame if it caught fire. Then there were tributes between kingdoms, bride prices, and compensation payments called wergeld. Accidentally kill someone's son, that's going to cost you. Steal a horse? Better have a pig and a tunic to spare. The economy wasn't just about what you had, but what you owed. Bad years made it worse. Famine meant fewer goods, fewer animals, more desperation. People abandoned lands. Some turned to crime. Others became bondsmen or bondsmaids, essentially signing themselves into service in exchange for food and shelter. It wasn't slavery, but let's just say it wasn't your dream job either. And yet, through all of it, people found ways to make it work. They reused, recycled, repaired. Old cloaks were turned into baby blankets. Broken pots became grain scoops. Bones became tools. Every item had a second, third, fourth life. It wasn't a cash economy or even a coin economy. It was a people economy, run on need and trust, skill and sweat, and occasionally a really good jug of mead. And so, as we look back on the so-called Dark Ages, maybe it's time to rethink that label. In their economy of survival, there was nothing dark about their ingenuity. Growing up in Dark Age Britain.
If you're picturing Dark Age childhood as endless days of stick-swinging, mud-eating freedom, well, you're not entirely wrong. But it wasn't all innocent frolicking.
In fact, growing up in post-Roman Britain was equal parts wild adventure and brutal survival course. Childhood wasn't just a phase, it was a training ground for life, death, and everything in between. Now, let's start at the very beginning, birth. Being born in the Dark Ages was, quite frankly, a gamble. Childbirth was one of the most dangerous things a woman could go through. There were no sterile gloves, no epidurals, and definitely no "it's a boy" balloons. Instead, there were midwives, usually older women of the village, who had learned their craft through sheer experience, whispered wisdom, and probably more than a few deeply unsettling herbal concoctions. Mothers gave birth at home, often squatting or kneeling, sometimes gripping ropes or the shoulders of other women for support. Fathers? Most weren't present. That was women's business, and frankly, many dads were more concerned about whether the newborn was a healthy heir than how many hours of labor it took to get them out. Harsh? Yes, but this was a world where survival trumped sentiment. If a child survived birth, and sadly, many didn't, then the real challenges began. Infant mortality was tragically high. Poor nutrition, dirty water, infections, and simple accidents claimed a heartbreaking number of babies. So when a child made it past infancy, it was cause for celebration, and perhaps a quiet sigh of relief. But surviving didn't mean playdates and picture books. Childhood in Dark Age Britain was, from a very early age, about preparing for your role in the community. The moment you could toddle without falling into the fire pit was the moment your education, if we can call it that, began. Little girls learned by following their mothers. They watched them spin wool, milk goats, prepare food, care for babies, and tend to small gardens. They didn't sit and take notes. They absorbed knowledge the way you absorb cold in a damp stone hut, gradually, inescapably, and all over. By the time a girl reached 10 or 11, she could cook a full meal, help birth livestock, weave a basic cloth, and carry buckets of water like a seasoned mule. Boys followed their fathers, or older brothers, uncles, or the grumpy guy who lived across the way and owed the family a favor. Boys learned to carve wood, tend animals, thatch roofs, and most importantly, use weapons. That's right. By the time a boy could lift a spear, someone was showing him how to throw it. After all, raids didn't care about age limits. Education wasn't universal, but it existed, especially among the elite. If you were the son of a noble or destined for the church, you might learn Latin, scripture, and arithmetic. Monasteries doubled as schools, and monks were some of the most educated people on the island. They copied manuscripts, read holy texts, and even wrote their own. But for most kids, books weren't just rare, they were incomprehensible. A child growing up in a farming village might never even see one. But that didn't mean children were ignorant, far from it. They learned their land, their seasons, the moods of animals and skies. They memorized stories and songs passed down through generations. Oral education, rich and vibrant. Imagine a child sitting by the fire, eyes wide, listening to tales of giants, dragons, Roman emperors, and ancient gods. That was their curriculum, myth and memory braided into survival skills. And yes, there was play. Kids are kids after all. They played with carved wooden toys, knuckle bones, hoops, and sticks. They invented games, chased each other through muddy lanes, and got into trouble. But even play was preparation. Wrestling? That's combat training. Running? That's future messenger practice. Climbing trees? Let's just call it early scouting. Social expectations kicked in fast. Girls were often considered marriageable by 12 or 13.
Boys were expected to pull their weight by the same age. Puberty wasn't a time of discovery and awkward selfies. It was your entry pass into adult life. If you were lucky, you got a few more years of youth. If you were unlucky, you were in battle by 15.
And let's not romanticize it too much. Childhood could be lonely and hard. Famine didn't skip the young, neither did disease. If war came to your village, it came for everyone. There were no safe zones, no child-only shelters. A child might watch a sibling die, a home burn, a parent fall in battle. These were scars that shaped entire generations. But children also formed bonds with each other, with elders, with animals. They learned resilience from their mothers, courage from their fathers, mischief from their friends, and hope from the sky above their smoky huts. They laughed, cried, survived, and, against all odds, sometimes thrived. Let's not forget fosterage, a common practice among nobility. A child might be sent to live with another family to strengthen alliances. Imagine being 10, packed off to a neighboring lord's household to learn manners, horsemanship, and swordplay. That's how warriors were made, and how friendships and feuds were born. Some fosterlings returned as loyal allies. Others, well, let's just say Christmas dinners got awkward. The church played a growing role too. If you entered a monastery as a child, some did as young as 7, your life took a different path. You'd rise before dawn, pray in Latin, work in silence, eat simple meals, and spend your days copying texts or tending gardens. It was quiet, disciplined, and not for everyone, but it offered stability, education, and sometimes, if you were clever, a path to influence. Girls could become nuns too, especially if they weren't expected to marry. Nunneries were safer, more autonomous spaces where women could teach, heal, write, and even lead. In a world where most girls were valued for wombs and dowries, the church offered a surprising alternative route. So, what did growing up really feel like in Dark Age Britain? It felt like a stormy sea. You swam as best you could, clinging to kin, culture, and craft. Some sank, some survived, a few soared. It was messy, loud, harsh, warm, terrifying, and beautiful, all at once. Because even in the darkest centuries, children laughed. Even under Saxon skies or Viking threats, they dreamed. They picked wildflowers, learned lullabies, and asked too many questions. And maybe, just maybe, those children, playing with sticks and memorizing riddles by firelight, helped carry Britain through the shadows into something brighter. Outro. So, what was life really like in Dark Age Britain? It wasn't all doom, gloom, and dragons, though the dragons would have been pretty cool. It was a time of fierce survival, community bonds, wild stories, and a world full of mystery that made every day feel like walking through a shadowy fog. People lived with one foot in reality and the other in the supernatural, juggling faith, fear, and the stubborn hope that tomorrow might be better. We've walked through the rough roads, the smoky huts, the lessons of childhood, and the whispered fears of witches and spirits. And maybe, just maybe, it's clear that life back then was as complex and vibrant as life today, just with fewer Wi-Fi signals and a lot more mud. Thanks for sticking with me on this journey through time. If you enjoyed stepping into the shoes and wooden clogs of those early Britons, hit that like button, subscribe, and share your thoughts below. What surprised you most? What would you want to ask a Dark Age villager if you had the chance? Until next time, keep wondering and keep wandering. History's got a lot more stories waiting in the shadows.